I'm not sure if I should say good afternoon or good evening, but I'm very happy to welcome everybody, and we're so thrilled to have Evelyn Granieri with us, a Columbus Citizens Foundation member, and somebody who actually very early in my tenure at Columbus Citizens Foundation offered to do a talk, and because I was a little slow to get acclimated, and then we had COVID interrupt a lot of activities. We're only getting to the talk now, but hopefully that means we've just perfected the art of doing these chats for our audience. And so I'm very glad you hung in there with us. And I'm not going to give a long introduction because I'm going to let Evelyn tell us about herself, but she's been a medical doctor and an educator and a specialist in geriatric medicine for some time, and started her education at University of Pittsburgh, and then got her medical degree from Northwestern University. And I think fairly soon afterwards came here to New York and has been associated with programs here in New York. So I'm going to turn it over to Evelyn to tell us a little bit about herself.
Thank you, Lisa. And I really am honored because, as I was telling Lisa and Michelle before, I'll never pass up the chance to try and tell you about medicine as a career and my path. I will tell you that I wanted to be a physician from the time I was in third grade. And I wrote an essay that I wanted to be a missionary nun doctor. And I had this vision of myself as a nun in China who was taking care of everything. And I'll also tell you that in the third grade, my teacher said, "You can't be a doctor, you're a girl." Thankfully, that's changed. But I progressed through and got to high school, and then became ill in high school. And I missed most of my sophomore year, most of my junior year, and about half of my senior year, but managed to graduate on time. And actually wanted to go to Columbia as an undergrad, but my father, because I'm from Niagara Falls, New York, and for those of you who know New York State, the western part of the state is a completely different country. He wasn't thrilled with the thought of me going to the city. So I ended up going to Syracuse, which I loved, and was a pre-med major. And then I had a real bumpy course in college. I got sick again and had to leave college in my first semester of my sophomore year. And I was out for a year. And then I came back and I was back for about a semester. And then my mom got sick. And so I didn't have to, I left college, and my younger sister and I took care of her until she died. And then I stayed home to take care of my father, because my father, who was, I'm a child of immigrants, my father had absolutely no clue what to do to support himself other than to go to work and come home every day. So I sort of had to teach him how to take care of himself in the home. And by the time I was ready to go back to college for the second time, my younger sister had caught up with me. And we were graduating from college we would be graduating from college at the same time. There was no way that was going to work for going to medical school, because we couldn't afford it. And actually, I couldn't afford to go to college if it wasn't for New York State scholarships and a whole bunch of other sort of financial aid packages I pieced together. And so my last 2 semesters of college, I changed majors. I had already enough for my biology and chemistry majors, but I added on human nutrition. And I graduated with a degree in human nutrition also. And I was a dietitian for about 3 years. While I was a dietitian, which was at Northwestern in Chicago, I supported my sister while she was in medical school. And then her last year, I applied to medical school and I got into Northwestern. And that's where I did medical school. I was 8 years older than my colleagues, the majority of my colleagues, and 10 years older than a whole bunch of them who had done a 6-year program, 2 years college, 4 years medical school. So I felt like a really old lady. I wasn't. I just turned 30, but I felt very old. You probably think that that was old too, but a very interesting medical school. I thought that the people I went to school with were actually so much younger than I that I didn't have a lot in common with them. I learned later that I did. And when I was in medical school, at the beginning, I was sure I was going to be an ear, nose, and throat surgeon because that's what I did during my dietitian career. I worked in the head and neck cancer unit. So I was sure that that was what I was going to do. But then when I got to medical school and I got to the operating room, I realized that I have a scar on my left thumb here. And I always, when people said, is it left or right? I had to look at my thumb and say, oh, it's left. I just, in my brain, I couldn't separate left from right. I realized that's no way to be a surgeon, especially when you have gloves on and you can't see the scar on your hand to tell you if it's the left or the right one. So what I really found when I was in medical school was that I absolutely loved two things. One was I liked teamwork. I liked working with nurses. There were no real nurse practitioners at the time, but nurses and therapists and social workers and everybody else. And the other thing is I loved stories. As I said, I come from an immigrant family, and we grew up sitting at the kitchen table. And although we were not allowed to speak Italian in those days, I could understand it, and I'd listen to my parents and my aunts and uncles and my grandmothers tell stories. Excuse me, please. I just loved hearing about people and how they got to where they were and what they were going to do, and how they appreciated things and what the transitions were from country to culture. And I loved those stories. And when I was with patients, I liked to hear about their history. And I also fell in love with old people. Keep in mind, I was 32 at the time. So anybody who was over 40 or 45 was old still to me. But I fell in love with the concept of that actually older people needed more care and different kind of care than young people. And at that time, geriatrics was like in its infancy. So when I finished medical school, I did training in internal medicine, which was 3 years. Then I did a fellowship in geriatric medicine, which at the time was also 3 years. I spent 2 years taking care of people and 1 year doing research. And then I was a geriatrician. I worked for a couple of years at Northwestern. And then I went to the University of Pittsburgh, where my younger sister, who finished medical school 3 years before I did, was. And I went there because family is important. She was married, and she had her second child, and I just couldn't bear the thought of the kids growing up without family nearby. So moved to Pittsburgh, and actually bought a house across the street from my sister. So it was like moving from Niagara Falls, the neighborhood in Niagara Falls. We moved to Pittsburgh, and we were together for about 14 years. And watch the kids grow up, and I'm still incredibly close with my niece and nephew. And then in 2003, I moved to New York, which, as I said before, if you're from the western part of the state, you think New York is I used to think it was still do. It's the most important place in the world, but I never thought I would have a chance at New York, but I moved. I was 50 when I moved, and didn't know a soul. And started at Mount Sinai. And I was the associate chair at Mount Sinai, and I worked at the Bronx VA. I was there for a few years. And then in 2006, was recruited to go to Columbia to start their Division of Geriatric Medicine and Aging. And I was there until December 31st of this past year. And I have multiple stories to tell you about COVID if anybody wants to hear, and how it was to take care of patients. 70% of my patients died during the time I was on the ward service, or taking care of patients in the hospital of COVID. And so I was there until December 31st, and now I'm an Emerita professor. And I'm also now at the City University of New York, where I'm helping them with geriatrics. I'm working with the New York State prison system and a group that's committed to making sure that older prisoners are treated well and evaluated well, and helping them to get parole so that they can rejoin society as an older adult, which is challenging. I'm working internationally, developing curricula for geriatrics and palliative care for second and third world countries. And what else am I doing? Oh, and I'm working with a bunch of other people to teach them how to take care of older adults. And I teach really pretty much locally, nationally, and internationally. So I'm all over the place trying to help people understand what it's like to take care of old people. But through all of this, through every facet of my career, I've taught in medical schools, every one that I was at. I've taught in colleges and in high schools, and actually anywhere anybody wants to learn about either medicine as a career or geriatrics as part of that career. Excuse me, please. And so that's why I'm honored to talk with you. I know that many of you are at different stages of where you want to go in life. But I think the reason I wanted to tell my story first is that I had a dream when I was 8 years old that I wanted to be a physician. And that despite, I think, some challenging situations, and the fact that my career path was not linear, I managed to get where I wanted to go initially. I never got to be a nun, but that's probably a good thing. I never got to be a missionary, but talking about geriatrics is kind of like mission work because you have to convert people to caring for old people. But I am firmly in love with the career choice that I made. Never once, not one day, even in the days of training where we would work. My first 3 years of training, we would have one total week off a year, no days off during the week, and you would get a week off for your vacation, and then every third night you'd be in the hospital overnight. But I never regretted doing that. I always was grateful for the opportunity to do that. And now I'm grateful for the opportunity to do a whole bunch of different things, if you will, but all of it focused on trying to make people's lives better as they get older. And to help people understand what it's like to be older and what it's like to be the challenges that a lot of old people face, not everybody, but a lot of old people face, and how we as a society need to be thoughtful about how we care for older adults. So that's my story of how
and it brings up so many themes. I'm not even sure which direction to take it. I think one thing that's fascinating is because geriatrics was a new field when you were training and entered it, and you've, in some ways helped set the standards for the field, you and colleagues, obviously. But I also think the life expectancy for people is so much later now. And also, I think, like your father, lots of people just assumed they would sort of work and retirement was going to be a very short aspect of their life. And today, people have much more of a chance to have a second act, whether it's full-on retirement or doing something that's not full-time work, but following a passion. And so I think the whole idea of caring for older people has changed quite a bit too. I mean, you and I have had some personal conversations because my mother lives with me and she would be very angry if I told her age. So we'll just say my mother's over 65. But, I think my mother's health is fantastic. And I hope when I'm my mother's age, I will be in as good a shape as she is. But even so, you start to think about things like living in Manhattan is actually fantastic if you're older because you can get everything delivered. The buses are actually quite easy to get on and off. And if you can't do that, there's taxis and Uber, and there's quite a number of ways to transport yourself around the city. So you get older and you don't get cut off from things you love. You can still go to museums and the theater or go hear live music, whatever your passion might be. And I think that's one thing that's changed quite a bit. I mean, I have an image of my grandmother and great grandmother from when I was growing up, that as they got older, they really got kind of housebound. And that isn't our expectation so much anymore. There's a real feel that part of what geriatric medicine can do is help people stay active as well as provide medical care for them. It's a mindset change in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's interesting because actually the life expectancy has increased somewhat in the last 30 years. Um, uh, Young people live longer because of infectious, we have a lot of control over infectious disease, but we won't talk about COVID. That's a whole other story. But there's two aspects of life expectancy that I think, anybody who's considering a career in medicine has to understand, because in truth, if someone is going into medicine, you're going to be financially secure. And you will be able to do all those things that Lisa said. But there's a whole contingent of people right here in the city who may not be able to do those kinds of things. And the reason that life expectancy in the United States actually has gone down 2 years in the past couple of years is because of gun violence and drug use. And so part of anybody considering going into medicine has to be the social aspect of it, is how we're going to serve the communities that we want to serve, by taking into account the sort of more global community that is New York at this point, or wherever you think you're going to land. But it is true that living in New York, if you're an older person, is so much better than living in a lot of other small towns or suburbs. It's challenging to be an old person in the suburbs once you can't drive anymore. And even though there is Uber in a lot of places, you don't have the accessibility that you have in the city and in the close surrounding environs. So, but you're right. What we try and do as geriatricians is to make sure people age as well as possible. And then when it comes to a point where, they're just not able to get around as well, or they have a lot of illnesses or things that are sort of impacting their life, we try and help them and their family members through it. I think it's, like I said, Lisa, that one of the reasons I like geriatrics was because it's a team sport. I'm a rabid Yankees fan, by the way. And so, it's really like playing baseball. Somebody's up at bat all the time. And that's that's the person who's directing sort of, if you will, how the inning is going, that third, fifth, whatever of the inning is going. But, people a lot of people get a chance up at bat to help take care of the person who needs help. And it isn't always the physician, and the physician may not always be the person who can provide the best kind of help. So, and it's always been that way. It'll always be that way. It's a challenge, but it's a good challenge.
Well, I have two questions that are not related that I would love for you to address. One is, there's a big difference between going into what I'll call public health, in the sense of being a physician working in a hospital, versus going into private practice. I mean, they're complementary aspects of the field, but the rhythm of how you work is quite different, I think, when you work in a hospital full time. And then my other comment is, most of us, for valid reasons, don't think much about what happens in the prison system and what happens to incarcerated people, particularly those with long sentences or life sentences. And, I would love for you to describe a little bit about the work you're doing with the prison system, because I think that's a very unexpected aspect of medical care for most of us.
Yeah, it is. I'm going to address your first point first. Now, let me address your second point first. So I actually got in, when I was a little girl, our parish priest used to take us to visit the sick and to visit incarcerated people who were from our parish. So it was very early on in my life that I got a chance to actually see what it was really the jail. I don't know if you know, there's a difference between jails and prison. Jail is where you're sort of waiting time to go to trial. And if you go to trial and you're convicted, then you get sent to a prison. So we went to the jails mostly. But I was actually inspired by a lawyer who wrote the book called Just Mercies, who was a Harvard educated Black guy who sort of found the calling to represent people on death row. And it was really only then that I got to see how challenging it is to take care of people who are in prisons, whether or not they're wrongfully committed or not, they're still deserving of care. And you're right, it's especially challenging for mostly men, because there weren't so many women who were long-termers who were incarcerated. And then many of them qualify for parole, but can't get parole because they've been separated from their families for so long, so they don't have a stable environment to which they can go. And so there's also a big challenge in getting services for them once they get out. They may not be able to get a job if they're young enough to get a job. And if they're old, they haven't paid into Social Security, so they don't have any money coming in. And it's difficult for them to get the services that they need and to actually survive on their own. So we're kind of working to change that by evaluating them while they are incarcerated to see what kinds of needs they have, what kinds of undocumented sort of medical conditions that they have, especially dementia, what kinds of functional issues they have. Can they walk? These guys have no idea how to use a cell phone. They haven't been to a store in 30 years. They haven't been outside. They haven't had anything but a regimented life for the past 30 years. And I have to tell you, many of them are in for minor drug infractions. New York State was especially tough in the 70s and 80s when it came to incarceration for drug possession. And this is stuff like grass, which today is legal. But when these guys were in their 20s was not. And so they were sent up for a long period of time. But they really don't know what it's like to be on the outside. So we really have to try and find services for them that help them get acclimated to life on the outside. And part of my job is to figure out what kinds of medical services they may need or how I can cooperate with social service systems to get them what they need in order to stay as independent as possible. And they're ever so grateful. And, as someone who's never been incarcerated, I can't even imagine what it's like for them. But I know that they really do want to try and succeed. These are not guys who committed felony murder or first-degree murder or things like that. These are guys who had, as we see it now in 2020, relatively minor infractions that got them sent up for a long time. So I think it's a good, for me, it's a very satisfying thing to do, to be able to help people as they get older, trying to get out into the community once again. And I can't say it's a field that's sexy. I can't say it's a field that draws a lot of people, but it certainly is a field that deserves some attention. If how we as a society treat people who are vulnerable and how we as a society give people a second chance, I think is very important and very telling.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, again, I had a friend who years ago volunteered in a literacy program at Rikers Island. And I think that was dealing with at-risk youth who'd been jailed, and, the opposite end of the spectrum, but the same idea that you don't want people to be completely lost in the system, and you want to try and help people have some opportunities for when they're released. You don't have to answer the question about the difference between, full-time in a hospital and private practice. And I want to just maybe qualify it with one thing. I guess it's not that, they're different, because I would imagine the demands on your time are different. And also maybe the demands on, keeping up with certain technologies as the hospitals address that. And also maybe even more so some of the telehealth medicine that's come into play as well. So that's, if that helps you answer the question, that's kind of where my head was.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So interestingly, an article came out this week that for the first time in history in the United States, fewer doctors are in private practice than who are employed. So as things are progressing, most physicians who are coming out of medical school and training will not be in private practice, but will actually be employed by hospital systems. They may choose to work in the inpatient setting or the outpatient setting, but they're going to be employees and not sort of independent practitioners. All my life I've done months and months of inpatient work, months and months of outpatient work, months and months of nursing home work, months and months of house calls. So I've been lucky enough in my career, which is another reason why I chose geriatrics, that I could do all of the above. Wasn't sort of, I don't want to say stuck, but I'll say stuck in one setting or another. What's happened now is that there's a whole new career of hospitalist medicine. So now many doctors are choosing to just work in the hospital, and they're hourly employees. Essentially, they come in at 8 o'clock, they're gone at 5. They don't have any work to do outside of the hospital. Unlike if you're in an outpatient practice, really you're on call all the time, and you go home and you take work home. And patients call you, you want to answer the phone call. In the hospital, it's like shift work. So it's been a huge paradigm shift in how medicine has been practiced in probably the last 20 or 30 years. And I have to say that I think for the next 20 years or so, there's going to continue to be shifts in the way medicine is practiced and who's paying for it. And how doctors are going to be held to different standards by different employers. I think the days of, setting up your shop and hanging out your shingle are for the most part gone, or will be very soon, as we all become employees of a healthcare system or a big conglomerate or something like that.
That's fascinating, actually. I didn't know that about the shift in medicine. That's a very big shift over the last several decades, and fascinating to see where that goes in the decades to come. Yeah. I want to make sure we have time for any questions from participants, but I actually think you've managed to weave together all of your, different wishes in life. So you didn't become a nun, but if we think about nuns, they're caring people, and you're certainly a very caring, empathetic person. And as you said, missionary, you've got covered by telling people about geriatric medicine. And then your years as a dietitian, I would imagine that plays a big role in geriatric medicine, because an awful lot of aging well is staying well nourished and eating properly and knowing how to control certain diseases through good habits. So you've managed to weave all of these things together very well, I think.
Pure luck. But I will say something about being a dietitian, and it applies to people who are thinking about medicine as a career now. And I remember, way back, a woman who was a physician, one of the few women I knew, said, if you want to get into medical school, you have to do something different. You have to stand out from the crowd. And it really, I can't tell you, it was like divine intervention or good fortune, or that I managed to choose a career. I wasn't in it very long, only a few years, but that really did help me when I applied to medical school. I was different from the straight biology and chemistry major that I had started out being, and so had something different to offer. And that's always the advice that I give people who are thinking about medical school. Try and figure out a way that you are not the standard person, whether it's through, activities that you do, whether it's paid or not, whether it's the services you provide your family, if it's caregiving or whatever, if it's a different kind of skill. In medical schools now, they're looking for people who are not straight biology, chemistry majors. They want you to be diverse in your thinking, diverse in your skill level, diverse in your background. And one of the things about the Columbus Citizens Foundation, I think, is that I think that it's always been important. I interview both people going into medical school and then people going into residency. And when I hear that they have a commitment to their culture, when they have a commitment to not to separate them from everyone else, but to blend it, but to recognize what their culture means to them and to bring positive aspects of the culture into the practice of medicine, then I always, I spend lots of time talking with those candidates to say, and they come from, I mean, cultures, they're from everywhere, but, you know, I think, especially in New York, the Italian culture stands for so much. And it has so much to offer in terms of both history and the way in which we interact with families and community, that I think it's really something that is a positive aspect if people are thinking about applying to medicine.
So I have one last question for you, since you do work with people from all stages, whether it's high school students who want to take the path to medical school, or college students or medical students, or those getting their training. What do you think, you know, is the sort of greatest moment of anxiety for a lot of those candidates now? I mean, technology once upon a time might have been something that people felt was daunting, but I'm imagining most students in the pipeline today have technology completely covered. You know, what do you think, you know, based on your experience right now, what do you think concerns people the most?
I'm going to talk about technology briefly, if it's okay.
Sure.
So people, you know, it is true that in the moment, we are incredibly skilled. I mean, because we're challenged every day, we do technology, different types. Obviously, all of you who are much younger use technology a bit differently than I do, but, you know, there's almost not an hour during the day when I'm not on some device doing something somewhere in the world. But what we don't realize is how dynamic this is, that the technology we're using now in June of 2020 is not the same technology we're going to be using in 4 or 5 years. And so we continue to learn every day, every day, every day. I think that, by the way, for older people, you know, they say, oh yeah, they know how to use their iPhone or they're on Facebook. You know, in a few years, it's going to be gone. I mean, really, I mean, Facebook's dead anyway, but all of that other stuff, you know, unless you continue to learn, you're sunk unless you're continually exposed to new technologies. But you're right. Most young people and most working people are pretty adept at the technologies that exist right now. I think what gives people anxiety is paying for student loans. There's the anxiety about getting into medical school. That is. And there's the anxiety about, well, what should I focus on? What should I major in? How do I study well for the MCATs? Once you're in medical school, how do I study for the boards? So the studying, the grades, which are challenging now because a lot of schools are doing pass-fail. MCATs, you know, they're still around, so you need to be attentive to them. And once you're in medical school, almost everybody has pass-fail, and then even the board. So people are trying to figure out ways to make themselves stand out from the crowd, if you will. But they're also thinking, I mean, most of the students in college and in medical school are trying to think about, how am I going to pay off my loan? Some schools like NYU, many students at Columbia and a bunch of other medical schools are offering free tuition.
Right.
A lot of it is need-based, but not all of it. And certainly the state medical schools are a real bargain, if you will. But those things are going to really continue to come into play. I was 52 when I finished paying off my student loans. And, you know, it was a bummer that I had to pay as much off in student loans as I did for my condominium when I lived in Chicago, or my house when I lived in Pittsburgh. But that was the way it was. My goal was to be a physician. And if it meant I wasn't going to be wealthy, but I'd be certainly much better off than 95% of the country, then that was fine with me. But I think a lot of students conflate the student loan challenge. And I think there are a lot of ways to help to pay it off or to get scholarships. Certainly, you know, the scholarships that, even if it's not large, putting together multiple small scholarships or grants is very helpful.
Well, I also, when we were chatting before the program started, we also mentioned that there are some specific universities and some government funded programs that, if you go into public service after medical school, help defray some of the costs as well. So, I mean, I guess one of the themes is you have to be very, very entrepreneurial and creative.
You do. You do. But, you shouldn't have to do it on your own. One of the other things that I try and tell people who are thinking about it is make as many contacts as you can. If somebody says to you, if I can help you, let me know, you let that person know. You get on, send an email, send a text, call them up. I don't care, whatever you do, make contacts and keep those contacts, because you never know when that person can help you, or even better, when you can help them. But you shouldn't have to be thinking about this loan. As I said, my family was an immigrant family. They didn't really know anything about financing. And I went to a school that really didn't send a whole lot of people to college. So I was lucky enough to have an older brother and sister who sort of paved the way a bit for me, and for my younger sister. But there are, go online, see what kinds of scholarships are available, see what kinds of opportunities there are to contribute to some organization or group that then will contribute to you in kind. And if your guidance counselor is not particularly helpful, reach out. And if you don't know who to reach out to, there are many of us who can help you find people or organizations or venues that might be able to help you. If we don't, if those of us who are in the field don't know, many of us have contacts who might know.
That's fantastic. Well, let's see if any of our participants have any questions. I'm going to say that people should feel free to write into the chat, but also we're a small enough group that if anybody would like to just unmute and ask a question, that's fine too.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So how many of you are in college right now? Can you just indicate via chat how many of you are in college?
Well, scanning the list that we're looking at, I'm not sure how many are in college. Hard for me to tell from looking at this list.
Okay.
Some of your fellow scholarship committee members have joined, and but anybody should feel free to ask a question. And if people don't have questions, I would love to hear from you, Evelyn, since you have participated in the scholarship program over the years, and you've interviewed a number of candidates, and you've made the point that even when scholarships are small, they make a big difference. I'm wondering if you've seen any interesting trends in the scholarship program. I mean, have you, when you talk to the college scholarship hopeful candidates, do they have a good sense of where they want to go after college? Or, I mean, college can be this wonderful moment of exploration where you discover the things that you thought you liked, you don't, and whole new worlds can open up for you. So
it's interesting that you should ask that question. And I'm going to address this to all of you, no matter where you are for applying. If you have to write a statement, make sure you get a number of people to read that statement. Because personally, I mean, in my past life at Columbia, I read maybe 500 statements a year at least. And the one thing that would turn me off, and I would, is if their grammar and spelling was bad. And I know this is not just for medicine, but I think to myself, if you don't take the time to look at the details of what it is that you write and how you put it down on paper, then I'm not sure I'm going to trust you with my patients, because it's all about being detail oriented and being thoughtful enough to present things in a very cogent and specific way. So my first advice before anything, and it may seem sort of trivial, but it's not, do not submit any statement to anybody to whom you're applying unless you have a number of people read it for you and have them critique it for grammar and sentence structure and spelling. Spell check's not enough, because spell check makes a lot of different mistakes and makes assumptions for the word that you want to use. So that's the other thing. The second thing is, I think that what I see, and sometimes I just want to hug the applicants, because I think, oh my God, you're in this by yourself. There's no need for you to be by yourself. I'm going to reiterate what I said. Reach out to anybody who you think can help you, who can listen to you, people who have been to college, people who have been to the college you want to apply to, people who've been to the medical school you think you want to apply to. Ask them what they think. Be informed about what you're applying for and who you're applying to. It takes some effort on your part. And not real effort. All you got to do is Google, or I don't care, go to their website and find out what the story is. But I find that a number of candidates who come through really don't have an idea about what they're applying for and the schools that they're applying to, or they've never met somebody who's in the field that they're thinking about applying for. Now I'm going to bring this up again. I know it was a different time and place. I didn't know any doctors when I was growing up. I had no clue. I watched TV and I saw, these are way before your time, so I won't even mention the TV shows. But for those of you who are on who may know, what really inspired me to think that I could be a physician as a girl was Dr. Kildare, because I saw a woman who was a doctor on that show and I thought, oh my God, there's a girl who's a doctor. But you know, there's so many places to reach out to. And once again, if you don't know who to reach out to, I'm gonna throw myself out there. You know, maybe I can help you figure out where you should go or what you should do or what kinds of people you should reach out to. But don't be out there on your own. There's no need for it. If your family's not professional, there are other professionals out there who would want to help you.
Well, I think that is one strong theme that comes through time and time again at Columbus Citizens Foundation, that members are really very willing, you know, to speak with people and to offer whatever guidance they can, or make the introduction that might be necessary that would help somebody. So I'm going to echo that theme. And I'm also going to say, I echo strenuously what you said about the attention to detail and writing the correct essay and the correct cover letter, and people should not discount that. The best class I ever took in college, believe it or not, was a professor who announced that anybody could write a 20-page paper. Few people could write a 2-page paper. And the assignment we had was every single week for the semester, we had to turn in a 2-page paper. And he announced 2 things. He would stop reading after 500 words. So if you thought you were going to fool him by putting it in teeny tiny type or, you know, small or wide margins, he would, after 500 words, he was stopping. And he allowed 3 errors. And after error 3, he would stop reading. So, you know, it didn't matter whether it was a comma that shouldn't be there, or, you know, a semicolon that didn't belong, or 3 typos. He was going to stop reading after 3 errors. And I will tell you that that class forced me to be very attentive to every word I selected. And if you could say it with 1 word instead of 4, you picked 1 word. And he was right, that art of getting what you want to say down to 500 words is much harder than writing a 20-page paper. You really have to decide what's the most important thing to say. And when you're writing an essay for college or medical school, or you're writing a personal statement as part of an application, you really have to think about what's going to stand out and what's going to be just the same thing everybody else is writing. So I think that's great advice.
Well, I will tell you that I am so familiar with the template stuff that's online. I can spot one of those essays like that, you know, especially medical school. I know I've read all of those template essays that are online and how you can sort of personalize it. They're, sorry.
You don't want to use those. Well, I don't know how this is possible because we're not usually a shy group, but there are no questions. And I know that we are keeping you from packing for your vacation. So I'm going to encourage people that if they think of questions later on, they know how to send an email to the foundation and we will forward it on to you. And in the meantime, I'm going to thank you from all of us at Columbus Citizens Foundation for your time and this great chat, and wish you a fantastic vacation.
Thank you very much. I'll also reiterate, if people have, if you're not in the mood for questioning, and I can understand that, if you have questions, I have an email, and once again, you can forward it to the the foundation, and they can ask me. I am more than thrilled. It is one of the joys of my life to have younger people email me and say, hey, do you have any advice about this? Or what do you think about that? Or do you know anybody who knows anything about that? And I always respond. Excuse me. Just so that you know, I'm a Yankees fan. I sleep with this in my hand. I'm in communication with people all over the world throughout the night. So, you know, you can wake me, you don't wake me up, trust me. But I'm always available. Even on vacation, I'm available. So don't hesitate. I just have to say this one last thing. I think one of the things that hinders younger people who don't have a lot of connections is they're afraid to ask, or they're afraid to, you know, they think maybe they're bothering someone, they don't know how to ask. My strongest advice is ask.
Well, that's a perfect note for ending, and I agree. We have to learn not to be so reticent. We have to be willing to be a little bold, and not be fearful of rejection if we ask for help. So
that's right. That's right.
All right. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye.